I was standing in my driveway washing my truck on a Saturday morning when Patricia Whitmore marched across the street with her clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. Her face already twisted into that expression I'd come to recognize over the past 6 months since she'd been elected HOA president. "Excuse me, Mr. Harrison," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to talk about your violations." I turned off the hose and wiped my hands on my jeans, trying to keep my expression neutral. "What violations would those be, Patricia?" She stopped at the edge of my driveway, careful not to step onto my property, and consulted her clipboard with the theatrical flair of someone who enjoyed this far too much. "Let's see. Your grass is exactly 3.2 inches tall. The HOA covenant clearly states that grass must be maintained between 2 and 3 inches. That's a $50 fine. Your mailbox needs repainting. Another $50. And you parked your truck in the driveway overnight instead of in the garage. That's $75. I stared at her for a long moment, water dripping from the hose onto the concrete. "Patricia, I've lived in this house my entire life. My grandfather built this place in 1952. There was no HOA when he laid the foundation." Her smile was cold and triumphant. "Well, there is now, and everyone in Riverside Meadows is subject to the same rules. No exceptions. You received the covenant agreement like everyone else 6 years ago when this community voted to establish the HOA." "I didn't vote for it," I said flatly. "Doesn't matter. The majority ruled, and you're bound by that decision. Now, I expect payment within 30 days or we'll be forced to place a lien on your property." She turned on her heel, her sensible shoes clicking against the pavement as she walked back toward her house across the street. I watched her go, feeling that familiar anger building in my chest. This wasn't the first time Patricia had targeted me, and it wouldn't be the last. Ever since she'd taken over as HOA president, she'd made it her personal mission to make my life miserable. The thing was, I'd been tolerating it because I didn't want trouble. I had my contracting business to run, and fighting with the HOA seemed like more hassle than it was worth. But 3.2 inches of grass, that was pushing it too far. I finished washing my truck and went inside, tracking water across the kitchen floor that my late wife Sarah would have scolded me for. She'd been gone 2 years now, cancer taking her way too young at 43, and I still caught myself listening for her voice sometimes. The house felt too big without her, too quiet except for when Patricia was screeching about some imaginary violation. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat down at the kitchen table, pulling out my phone to look at the latest notice from the HOA. It was the 4th one this month. The previous 3 had been about my fence being the wrong shade of white, my front door wreath being too large, and my garden gnome being visible from the street. I'd paid those fines like an idiot, not wanting to rock the boat, but this was getting ridiculous. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Marcus, who lived 3 streets over in the same neighborhood. "Dude, Patricia just hit me with a $200 fine for having my garbage cans visible from the street on a non-collection day. I forgot to bring them in because I was at work." "This is insane," I texted back. "She got me for 3.2-inch grass. Are you kidding me? That woman needs to get a life." He wasn't wrong. Patricia was 52, divorced, no kids, and apparently had nothing better to do than measure people's grass and patrol the neighborhood looking for violations. She drove a pristine white Lexus SUV and wore the same style of khaki capri pants and pastel-colored polo shirts every single day like it was some kind of uniform. Her house was immaculate, her yard looked like something out of a magazine, and she'd turned being the HOA president into a full-time job that nobody asked her to take so seriously. That evening, I was grilling some chicken on my back patio when my neighbor to the east, old Mr. Chen, shuffled over to the fence that separated our properties. He was 86, had lived in Riverside Meadows since 1965, and was one of the few people left who remembered when this had been actual farmland outside Sacramento. "Harrison," he called out, his voice raspy. You got hit with fines too? I walked over to the fence. Yeah, grass too long, apparently. He shook his head, his weathered face creasing with disgust. This HOA business is nonsense. Your grandfather would roll over in his grave if he knew what was happening to this neighborhood. Thomas Harrison was a good man, built half these houses with his own 2 hands. I nodded. My grandfather had been a contractor and developer back in the 50s. He'd purchased a large tract of land on the outskirts of Sacramento and developed it into a neighborhood of modest, well-built homes for returning veterans and young families. He'd built our family home first, the one I was standing in now, and then developed the rest of the street and the surrounding blocks over the next decade. Mr. Chen, do you remember if my grandfather kept any records, property deeds, development documents, anything like that? The old man scratched his chin. Well, your grandmother probably had all that. When she passed, didn't you clean out their things? I had, but that was 15 years ago, and I'd been more focused on grieving than on carefully cataloging old documents. Most of their personal effects had gone into boxes in my attic, where they'd been sitting undisturbed ever since. I might need to go through those boxes, I said. Mr. Chen's eyes sharpened with understanding. You thinking of fighting back against that Whitmore woman? Maybe. She's gone too far this time. He grinned, showing teeth that were remarkably intact for his age. Good. Someone needs to put her in her place. She tried to fine me last month for having too many wind chimes, said they were a noise violation. I told her where she could stick her clipboard. I laughed despite myself. What happened? She backed down. I think she's afraid of me because I'm old and might keel over from the stress, and she doesn't want that on her conscience. But you're young and healthy. She thinks she can bully you. After dinner, I climbed up into my attic, pulling down the folding ladder and ascending into the dusty, hot space that smelled like old insulation and memories. The boxes were stacked along the far wall, labeled in my hasty handwriting from all those years ago. Grand's kitchen. Grandpa's workshop. Photos? Documents. I pulled down the box labeled Documents and carried it back downstairs, setting it on the dining room table. Inside were manila folders stuffed with papers, old tax returns, receipts, letters, and various legal documents. I started sorting through them, not entirely sure what I was looking for, but hoping I'd know it when I saw it. It took me 2 hours of searching before I found it. The deed was in a folder marked Property Records, and it was dated September 15, 1952. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the text was still clear. Thomas Harrison had purchased 147 acres of land from the Riverside Agricultural Company for the purpose of residential development. The deed included a detailed plot map showing how the land would be subdivided into individual lots. But it was the language in the deed that caught my attention. There was a clause, written in the formal legal language of the 1950s, that stated, "The original purchaser and developer, Thomas Harrison, retains perpetual development rights and primary authority over all land use decisions within the boundaries of the described property, including but not limited to architectural standards, property modifications, and community governance structures. These rights are transferable to direct descendants and legal heirs." I read it 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. My grandfather had essentially written into the original deed that he, and by extension his heirs, had final say over anything that happened in the neighborhood he'd developed. If I was reading this correctly, and if this deed was still legally valid, then the HOA might not have the authority they thought they had. I pulled out my phone and called my friend Derek, who was a real estate attorney in downtown Sacramento. It was late, almost 9 o'clock, but Derek and I had been friends since high school and I knew he'd take my call. "Mike Harrison, what's going on?" he answered on the 3rd ring. "Derek, I need your legal brain." I found my grandfather's original property deed for Riverside Meadows, and there's some interesting language in it about development rights and governance. Can you take a look at it? Is this about your HOA? Yeah. Patricia Whitmore is driving me insane, and I'm wondering if she actually has the authority she thinks she has. Derek was quiet for a moment. Bring the deed to my office Monday morning. I'll take a look. If what you're suggesting is true, this could be really interesting. Original deed language sometimes supersedes later agreements, especially if those agreements violate or contradict the original terms. I spent the rest of the weekend digging through more boxes and finding additional documents. I found the original plot plans my grandfather had drawn up, correspondence with the county about zoning and permits, and even some old photos of the neighborhood being built. There were pictures of my grandfather standing in front of partially constructed houses, his contractor's belt around his waist, a proud smile on his face. He'd built something real here, something lasting, and Patricia Whitmore was trying to turn it into her personal fiefdom. Monday morning, I was at Derek's office at 8 sharp. His secretary showed me into his conference room, and Derek came in a few minutes later with 2 cups of coffee. "Let's see what you've got," he said, settling into his chair. I spread out the deed and the supporting documents on the table. Derek put on his reading glasses and began examining everything carefully, making notes on a legal pad as he read. The silence stretched out for almost 20 minutes before he sat back and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mike, this is potentially explosive. If this deed language is still enforceable, and I think it might be, then your HOA was established in violation of the original property rights. Your grandfather retained what's essentially a master easement over the entire development. That means any subsequent governance structure would need approval from the deed holder or their heirs. Did your grandfather ever approve the creation of the HOA? He died in 1998. The HOA was established in 2020. So no, he couldn't have." Derek nodded slowly. "And did you, as his heir, approve it? They sent around a petition 6 years ago. I didn't sign it. I didn't vote for or against it. I just ignored it because I didn't think it mattered." "Did they get unanimous approval from all property owners?" "No, it was a majority vote. Something like 65% in favor." Derek tapped his pen against his legal pad. "Okay, here's the situation. Normally, HOAs can be established by a majority vote of property owners, and even non-consenting owners are bound by that decision if the proper legal procedures were followed. However, in this case, there's a superior property right established by the original deed. Your grandfather's development rights clause is unusual, but it's not unprecedented. The question is whether it's still valid after all these years and multiple property transfers. What do we need to do to find out? We need to do a title search on every property in the development to trace the chain of ownership back to your grandfather's original conveyances. We need to see if this deed was properly recorded and if it's been referenced in subsequent property transfers. And we might need to challenge the HOA's authority in court. I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. "That sounds expensive," Derek smiled. "It won't be cheap, but I'll give you the friend rate. Plus, if we're successful, we could potentially recover legal fees from the HOA. They've been collecting dues and fines for 6 years. If they've been operating without proper authority, that's a problem." "How big of a problem?" "For them, potentially very big. For you, this could mean you're not subject to their fines or rules." "But Mike, I need to warn you, this is going to get ugly. If you challenge the HOA's fundamental authority to exist, Patricia Whitmore and her board are going to fight back hard. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the mounting fines, the constant harassment, the way Patricia patrolled the streets like she owned them. I thought about my grandfather building these houses, creating a community where people could raise their families in peace. And I thought about Sarah, who'd loved this house and this neighborhood, and how she'd always said I needed to stand up for myself more. "Yeah," I said, "I'm prepared." Derek started the title search that week, and within 10 days, he'd assembled a comprehensive history of every property in Riverside Meadows. The development consisted of 68 homes, all of which traced their ownership back to my grandfather's original deed. More importantly, the deed language about development rights had been properly recorded with Sacramento County and was referenced in every single property transfer that had occurred over the past 70-plus years. "Mike, this is holding up," Derek told me over the phone. "The original deed restrictions are still in effect. The HOA was established without consulting you as the deed holder's heir, which means they're operating without proper authority. So what's our next move?" We send a cease and desist letter to the HOA board, informing them of the deed language and demanding they stop all enforcement actions and fine collections until this matter is resolved. We'll give them 30 days to respond. If they don't back down, we file suit to invalidate the HOA's authority. The letter went out on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, my phone was ringing off the hook. Patricia Whitmore called 6 times before I finally answered. "Mr. Harrison, what is the meaning of this letter?" Her voice was shrill with barely contained fury. "It means exactly what it says, Patricia. My grandfather developed this neighborhood, and the original deed gives his heirs authority over governance structures. The HOA was established without my consent, and I'm challenging its validity." "That's absurd. This HOA was legally established by a vote of the homeowners. You can't just decide you're not subject to it because of some dusty old paperwork. That dusty old paperwork is a legally binding deed that's been on file with the county for over 70 years. If you want to dispute it, you're welcome to respond through your attorney. You're making a huge mistake, Mr. Harrison. The HOA has rules for a reason to maintain property values and community standards. Without us, this neighborhood would fall apart. Patricia, this neighborhood existed for nearly 70 years before your HOA showed up, and it did just fine. Maybe better than fine, since people weren't getting harassed over 3.2-inch grass." She hung up on me. 10 minutes later, Marcus texted, "Dude, what did you do?" "The neighborhood email chain is blowing up. Patricia is losing her mind." I called him and explained the situation. Marcus started laughing so hard I thought he might hurt himself. "Man, this is perfect. She's been terrorizing everyone for 2 years. Please tell me you're actually going to win this. Derek thinks we have a strong case, but it's going to get messy." "Good. She deserves messy. Do you know she tried to fine the Johnsons $300 because their 10-year-old drew a hopscotch court on their driveway with chalk? She said it was graffiti." Mrs. Johnson cried. The HOA's response came 23 days later, delivered by a process server to my front door. They weren't backing down. Instead, they were countersuing, claiming I was trying to disrupt a legally established governance structure and demanding I pay all outstanding fines plus penalties for non-compliance. The total they were claiming I owed was now up to $1,500. Derek filed our lawsuit the next day in Sacramento County Superior Court. We were seeking a declaratory judgment that the HOA had been established without proper authority, and an injunction preventing them from collecting fines or enforcing rules until the matter was resolved. We also filed a counterclaim against the HOA for harassment and abuse of process. The local media picked up the story within a week. A reporter from the Sacramento Bee called me for an interview, and I spent an hour explaining the history of the neighborhood and my grandfather's role in developing it. The story ran on the front page of the local section with the headline, "Grandson Challenges HOA with 1952 Deed, Claims Authority Over Neighborhood." That's when things really escalated. Patricia wasn't just calling me anymore. She was calling everyone in the neighborhood, trying to drum up support for the HOA's position. She sent out a mass email claiming I was trying to destroy property values and turn Riverside Meadows into a lawless slum. She organized a neighborhood meeting at the community center and invited everyone except me. Mr. Chen called me the night of the meeting. "Harrison, you need to know what's happening here. Patricia is telling everyone that if you win, there will be no rules at all. She's saying people will be able to paint their houses neon colors, park junk cars on their lawns, let their properties fall apart. She's scaring people." That's not what this is about, Mr. Chen. I don't want to eliminate reasonable standards. I just want to stop the harassment and the nickel and dime fining. I know that, but she's got people worked up. Some of them are talking about pooling money to help the HOA fight you in court. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. I hadn't wanted to turn this into a neighborhood civil war, but Patricia was forcing the issue. I needed to get my side of the story out. I spent the next evening drafting my own email to the neighborhood distribution list. I explained my grandfather's history as the original developer, the language in the deed, and my position that the HOA had overreached its authority. I emphasized that I wasn't against having community standards, but I was against the aggressive enforcement and excessive fines that had become Patricia's trademark. I included copies of the original deed and plot plans, showing people the actual language we were disputing. The response was mixed. Some people reached out to support me, sharing their own horror stories about Patricia's enforcement tactics. Others accused me of being selfish and trying to exempt myself from rules everyone else had to follow. A few people suggested a compromise, maybe restructuring the HOA with more reasonable rules and less aggressive enforcement. But Patricia wasn't interested in compromise. At the next HOA board meeting, which I attended despite not being invited, she doubled down. The meeting was held in Patricia's living room, and when I showed up, she tried to refuse me entry. "This is a closed board meeting, Mr. Harrison. Members only. I'm a homeowner in this community, and this meeting concerns me directly. Under California law, HOA meetings have to be open to all members unless they're specifically executive sessions dealing with legal matters or personnel issues." "Is this an executive session, Patricia?" Her face flushed red. "No, but you're not welcome." "Then I'm staying." Derek had coached me on this. HOA boards had to follow specific rules about open meetings and transparency, and Patricia had been playing fast and loose with those requirements for years. I walked past her and took a seat on her sofa. 3 other board members were there. Bob Mitchell, who owned an insurance agency in town, Susan Rodriguez, a retired teacher, and Kevin Zhang, who worked in tech. They all looked uncomfortable. Patricia sat down across from me, clutching her clipboard. "Fine, let's begin. First item of business is the legal challenge from Mr. Harrison. Our attorney has advised us that we have a strong case and should fight this vigorously. The HOA has been legally operating for 6 years, collecting dues and maintaining standards. We cannot allow one person to undermine that." Bob Mitchell cleared his throat. "Patricia, I've been reading the deed language that Mike provided. I'm not a lawyer, but it does seem like there might be a legitimate issue here with the original development rights. Have we considered negotiating some kind of settlement?" Patricia's glare could have melted steel. "Absolutely not. If we give in to this, we set a precedent that anyone can challenge our authority. We need to show strength." Susan Rodriguez spoke up, her voice hesitant. "But Patricia, some of the fines we've been issuing do seem excessive. Maybe this is an opportunity to review our policies and make them more reasonable." "Our policies are fine, Susan. The problem is people who don't want to follow rules, people who think they're special and deserve exemptions." She looked directly at me when she said this. I kept my voice calm and level. "I don't want an exemption. I want the HOA to stop operating outside its authority. My grandfather's deed gives his heirs final say over governance structures in this development. That's not something I made up. It's black and white in the recorded documents." Kevin Zhang leaned forward. "If that's true, and I'm not saying it is or isn't, but if it is, then what exactly are you proposing? Do you want to dissolve the HOA entirely?" It was a fair question, and I'd been thinking about this a lot over the past few weeks. "I want the HOA to acknowledge the limits of its authority. I want reasonable enforcement of reasonable rules. No more $50 fines for grass being 0.2 inches too long. No more harassment over garden gnomes or door wreaths. No more threatening liens on people's homes because they forgot to bring in their garbage cans on time." Patricia stood up abruptly. "This is my home and I want you to leave. This conversation is over." Actually, you opened this board meeting to me, and under HOA bylaws, I have the right to address the board on matters that concern me. Unless you want to add improper meeting procedures to the list of things you're doing wrong, I suggest you sit back down." For a moment, I thought she might actually try to physically remove me, but Bob Mitchell intervened, his voice firm. "Patricia, sit down. Mike is right. We need to follow proper procedures, especially now with a lawsuit pending." She sat, but her whole body was rigid with anger. The rest of the meeting was tense and unproductive, with Patricia shutting down any discussion of compromise or settlement. When it finally ended, Bob pulled me aside as I was leaving. "Mike, listen. I think you might have a valid point about the original deed. But more than that, I think Patricia has been out of control for a while now. Some of us on the board have been uncomfortable with how aggressive she's been with enforcement, but she's very domineering and it's hard to push back. If your lawsuit forces a restructuring of the HOA, that might not be the worst thing." I appreciated his honesty. "I'm not trying to destroy the community, Bob. I just want things to be reasonable. I know, and for what it's worth, I'm going to start asking more questions at board meetings. Patricia shouldn't have unilateral control over everything." The case moved slowly through the court system, as these things tend to do. Derek filed motions, the HOA's attorney filed counter motions, and we spent months in discovery, exchanging documents and taking depositions. Patricia's deposition was particularly contentious. She insisted that the HOA had absolute authority and that my grandfather's deed language was outdated and irrelevant. She couldn't explain why the deed had never been challenged or superseded in 70 years. But she maintained that the majority vote to establish the HOA overrode any previous restrictions. My deposition was more straightforward. I explained the history of the neighborhood, my grandfather's role, and my position that the HOA had been established without proper authorization. The HOA's attorney, a sharp woman named Jennifer Carlisle, tried to paint me as someone who just didn't want to follow rules, but I held firm. This wasn't about avoiding rules. It was about improper authority and excessive enforcement. The breakthrough came during Bob Mitchell's deposition. He'd been called as a witness by both sides, given his position on the HOA board. During questioning, Derek asked him about the HOA's enforcement practices. "Mr. Mitchell, in your role as a board member, have you ever raised concerns about the enforcement policies?" Bob hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Yes, several times. Can you give examples?" "Well, there was the situation with the Johnson family and the chalk drawing. I thought a $300 fine was excessive for children playing. There was the Chen issue with the wind chimes. I thought that was overreach. And there have been numerous times when when President Whitmore, has issued fines that seemed designed more to punish than to address legitimate violations." "Did you express these concerns to President Whitmore?" "I did, yes." "What was her response?" Bob looked miserable. "She told me that strict enforcement was necessary to maintain standards, and that if I wasn't willing to support the board's authority, I should resign." This testimony was gold for our case. It showed a pattern of excessive enforcement and a board president who wasn't interested in reasonable governance. Derek made sure to include it prominently in our brief when we filed for summary judgment. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early October. I took the day off from work and met Derek at the courthouse downtown. The courtroom was surprisingly full. Several of my neighbors had shown up, including Marcus, Mr. Chen, and the Johnsons. On the other side of the gallery, Patricia sat with her attorney and a handful of her supporters. Judge Margaret Reeves presided. She was in her early 60s with silver hair and a reputation for being thorough and fair. She'd reviewed all the briefs and evidence in advance, and she got right to the point after we'd all been sworn in. "This is an unusual case," she began. "We have a homeowners association that was established by majority vote in 2020, which would normally be sufficient to create a valid governance structure. However, We also have a deed from 1952 with language that appears to reserve certain rights to the original developer and his heirs. The question before this court is whether that deed language is still enforceable and, if so, whether it supersedes the HOA's authority. She looked at Jennifer Carlisle. "Counsel for the HOA, make your argument." Carlisle stood and approached the podium. "Your Honor, the HOA was legally established according to California law. The homeowners voted by a clear majority to create a governance structure. Mr. Harrison's claim that a 70-year-old deed gives him veto power over community decisions is without merit. Property law has evolved significantly since 1952. The deed language he's relying on is an anachronism that cannot override the democratic decision of current homeowners to govern themselves." Judge Reeves nodded. "And what do you say to the argument that the deed language establishes a master easement or superior property right?" "Your Honor, even if we accept that interpretation, which we don't, such rights can be abandoned through non-enforcement. Mr. Harrison's grandfather never exercised these supposed rights during his lifetime. Mr. Harrison himself didn't object to the HOA's formation for 6 years. That constitutes abandonment. But he didn't consent to it either," the judge pointed out. "He simply didn't respond to the petition." "Silence is acquiescence, Your Honor. If he had serious objections, he should have raised them at the time." Judge Reeves turned to Derek. "Counsel for the plaintiff, your response." Derek stood, and I could see the confidence in his posture. He'd prepared for this moment thoroughly. "Your Honor, the deed language is clear and unambiguous. Thomas Harrison retained development rights and authority over community governance structures. This isn't an abandoned right. It's a properly recorded deed restriction that runs with the land. Every property owner in Riverside Meadows took title subject to this restriction. The HOA's formation didn't eliminate it, and my client's silence doesn't constitute abandonment when he never received proper notice that his consent as deed holder was required." "Did the HOA make any effort to determine whether there were superior property rights before forming?" the judge asked. "No, Your Honor. They conducted a simple majority vote without doing any title research or determining whether the original development had restrictions on governance structures." Judge Reeves looked thoughtful. "What relief is your client seeking?" "We're asking the court to declare that the HOA was formed without proper authority and cannot enforce its covenants against property owners who don't consent. We're also seeking an injunction against further enforcement actions and a refund of fines collected from my client." The judge called a brief recess to review some documents. When she returned, she had the original deed in front of her, along with a thick file of case law that both sides had cited. "I've reviewed the deed language carefully," she began, "and I've considered the arguments from both sides. This is indeed unusual, but the law is clear. Deed restrictions that are properly recorded and that establish superior property rights do not simply disappear because they're old. They remain enforceable unless they're explicitly released or unless they violate public policy, which this one does not." Patricia made a small sound of protest, and her attorney put a hand on her arm. "The language in Mr. Thomas Harrison's original deed is specific and clear. He retained what amounts to a master development right over the community he created. That right is transferable to his heirs. Mr. Michael Harrison, as the grandson and legal heir, holds that right today. The HOA's formation without consulting him or obtaining his consent as deed holder violates the terms of the original deed." Carlisle stood. "Your Honor, if I may." "You may not, counsel. I'm issuing my ruling." Judge Reeves looked stern. "The HOA is hereby declared to have been formed without proper authority. However, I'm not dissolving it entirely. Instead, I'm ordering that the HOA's covenants and enforcement powers are only valid against homeowners who explicitly consent to them. Mr. Harrison, as deed holder, cannot be compelled to submit to HOA authority. Neither can any other homeowner who chooses to opt out. This was actually better than I'd hoped for." The judge was essentially making the HOA voluntary rather than mandatory. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm ordering the HOA to refund all fines collected from Mr. Harrison, plus interest. The HOA is enjoined from taking any enforcement action against him or placing any liens on his property. As for the broader community, I'm ordering the HOA board to send notice to all homeowners informing them of this ruling and giving them the option to opt out of HOA governance if they choose. Patricia stood up suddenly. Your Honor, this is outrageous. You're destroying our community. Judge Reeves fixed her with a cold stare. Ma'am, you will sit down and be silent, or I will hold you in contempt. Your attorney can speak for you. Patricia sat, her face mottled with rage. Carlyle stood again, more composed. Your Honor, we respectfully disagree with this ruling and intend to appeal. That's your right, counsel, but the injunction stands pending any appeal. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder, grinning. Mr. Chen gave me a thumbs up from his seat. The Johnsons were hugging each other. On the other side of the courtroom, Patricia was having what looked like a complete meltdown, gesturing wildly while Carlyle tried to calm her down. Several of her supporters looked shocked and dismayed. Derek and I walked out of the courthouse together. That went better than expected, he said. Judge Reeves could have ruled more narrowly, but she saw the bigger issue about Patricia's enforcement tactics. The opt-out provision is huge. What happens now? The HOA has to send out the notice to homeowners. My guess is you're going to see a mass exodus from HOA governance. Once people know they can opt out without penalty, a lot of them will, especially the ones who have been on the receiving end of Patricia's fine sprees. He was right. The notice went out the following week, and within 30 days, 42 of the 68 homeowners had filed opt-out paperwork. The HOA, which had been collecting monthly dues from everyone, suddenly found itself with less than half its previous revenue. More problematically for Patricia, the people who opted out were disproportionately the ones who'd been most heavily fined and most vocal about the excessive enforcement. The remaining 26 homeowners who stayed in the HOA included Patricia's close friends and supporters, along with a few people who genuinely liked having strict rules and enforcement. But the power dynamic had completely shifted. The HOA no longer controlled the neighborhood. Patricia tried to maintain her authority over the holdouts, but even that began to crumble. At the next board meeting, Bob Mitchell, Susan Rodriguez, and Kevin Zhang all voted to remove her as president, citing her erratic behavior and the damage her leadership had caused. She was furious, threatening to sue the board, but ultimately there was nothing she could do. The bylaws gave the board the power to remove officers, and they exercised it. Bob became the new president, and the first thing he did was revise all the enforcement policies to be more reasonable and community-focused. Fines were reduced, enforcement became complaint-based rather than patrol-based, and the emphasis shifted from punishment to maintaining genuine community standards. Meanwhile, Patricia wasn't done. She filed an appeal of Judge Reeves' ruling, and the case dragged on for another 8 months. During that time, she became increasingly isolated in the neighborhood. People crossed the street to avoid her. She stopped getting invited to neighborhood gatherings. Her once pristine yard began to show signs of neglect, and her house went on the market in the spring. The appellate court's ruling came down on a warm June afternoon. Derek called me with the news. They upheld Judge Reeves. The HOA's appeal is denied. It's over, Mike. I sat down on my back patio, looking out at the yard where my grandfather had once taught me to throw a baseball, where Sarah and I had planned our future, where I'd built a life. It's really over, it's over. The HOA can't touch you, the opt-out provision stands, you won. That weekend, Marcus organized a neighborhood barbecue for everyone who'd opted out of the HOA. We gathered in his backyard, grilling burgers and drinking beer, celebrating not just the legal victory, but the restoration of what the neighborhood had always been supposed to be. A community of people who looked out for each other without needing someone with a clipboard telling them their grass was 0.2 inches too tall. Mr. Chen brought his wind chimes, which he hung from Marcus's tree with ceremony. The Johnsons brought their daughter, who drew an elaborate hopscotch court on Marcus's driveway in multicolored chalk. Someone brought a garden gnome and placed it prominently on the patio table like a trophy. As the sun set and kids ran around playing tag while adults talked and laughed, I thought about what my grandfather would have made of all this. He'd built this neighborhood to be a place where people could live freely, raise families, pursue happiness. Somehow, in the name of protecting property values and maintaining standards, we'd almost lost that. Patricia had tried to turn a community into a kingdom where she made all the rules, but the thing about kingdoms is they require subjects willing to be ruled. And we'd decided we weren't interested in that arrangement. I never saw Patricia again after that summer. Her house sold in July, and she moved somewhere across town. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she joined the board of her new HOA, but I hoped for her neighbors' sake that she'd learned something from the experience. Though honestly, I doubted it. Life in Riverside Meadows settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. The voluntary HOA continued to exist for those who wanted it, but they focused on organizing community events and maintaining common areas rather than enforcement and fines. Bob Mitchell turned out to be a good president, the kind of leader who brought people together rather than driving them apart. As for me, I got my refund from the HOA, a check for $1,500 plus interest. I used it to replace my mailbox, which actually did need some work, and to install a new front door wreath, a big autumn one with pumpkins and colorful leaves that Sarah would have loved. I made sure it was visible from the street. Derek sent me his bill, which was substantial but fair. I paid it without complaint. It had been worth every penny to stand up for what was right, to honor my grandfather's legacy, and to restore some sanity to a neighborhood that had almost been strangled by someone's need for control. One afternoon in late September, almost a year after the whole ordeal had begun, I was out in my front yard planting some new shrubs. I'd let my landscaping go a bit during the legal battle, and I wanted to fix it up. Not because anyone was forcing me to, but because I took pride in my home and wanted it to look nice. A car pulled up and a young couple got out, looking at the house 2 doors down that had recently gone up for sale. They saw me working and walked over. "Hi," the woman said. "We're thinking about buying in this neighborhood. Can you tell us what it's like living here?" I stood up, wiping dirt from my hands. "It's a good neighborhood, quiet, friendly, been here a long time, good mix of families and retirees." "Is there an HOA?" the man asked. "We've had some bad experiences with HOAs in the past," I smiled. "There is an HOA, but it's voluntary. You can join if you want to, or you can opt out, no pressure either way." They looked at each other with visible relief. "Voluntary, that's unusual." "Long story," I said. But the short version is this neighborhood was built by people who believed in personal freedom and good neighbors looking out for each other. We had someone try to change that, but the community pushed back. Now we've got a good balance. People take care of their properties because they want to, not because someone's threatening them with fines. The woman smiled. "That sounds perfect. We've been looking for a place that feels like a real community." "Then you'd probably like it here. If you end up buying, my name's Mike Harrison." "Welcome to Riverside Meadows." They thanked me and headed back to their car to look at the house. I watched them go, thinking about cycles and change, about how communities evolve and adapt. My grandfather had built this neighborhood with his hands and his vision. Patricia had tried to reshape it in her image, all rules and control and fear. And now we were finding our way back to something in between, something sustainable and humane. That night, I pulled out the old photos of my grandfather again, the ones showing him building these houses. In one picture, he was standing with a group of other men, all of them in work clothes, all of them looking proud of what they were creating. They were building more than houses. They were building homes, places where people would live and love and raise their children, where memories would be made and lives would unfold. I thought about Sarah, who would have loved seeing me stand up to Patricia. She'd always said I was too accommodating, too willing to let people push me around to avoid conflict. Sometimes, she'd told me once, you have to fight for what matters. Not everything, not every little thing, but the important stuff. You have to fight. She'd been right. This had been worth fighting for. I put the photos back in their box and carried them up to the attic, but before I did, I made copies of my favorites. I had them framed and hung them in my study, a reminder of where this neighborhood came from and what it represented. One picture in particular became my favorite. My grandfather standing in front of our house, which was just a frame at that point, no walls yet, just the bones of what it would become. He was looking at the camera with this expression of determination and hope, like he could see the future and knew it was going to be good. The following spring, I started a new project. With permission from the voluntary HOA and support from neighbors both in and out of the HOA, we created a small memorial park on a piece of common ground at the neighborhood entrance. We installed a plaque that read, Riverside Meadows, established 1952 by Thomas Harrison, builder and visionary. A community built on freedom, respect, and neighborly care. At the dedication ceremony, Mr. Chen gave a speech about the old days when my grandfather was developing the neighborhood. Tom Harrison believed in people, he said, his voice wavering with age but still strong. He believed if you gave them good homes and treated them with respect, they'd build a good community. He didn't need rules and fines and threats. He just needed to trust people to do the right thing, and mostly they did. Bob Mitchell spoke too, acknowledging the difficult period the neighborhood had gone through and the lessons learned. We lost our way for a while, he admitted. We let fear and control take over from trust and community. Mike Harrison's challenge to the HOA wasn't just about legal rights. It was about reminding us what this place was meant to be. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. My grandfather built this neighborhood with his hands, but more than that, he built it with his values. Those values almost got lost, but they're too strong to disappear completely. This memorial isn't just about honoring the past. It's about committing to the future. To being good neighbors, to respecting each other's freedom, to remembering that rules should serve people, not the other way around. There was applause, and then someone brought out a cake, because every neighborhood gathering needs cake, and we spent the rest of the afternoon just being together, being neighbors, being the community my grandfather had envisioned all those years ago. Patricia's name never came up once, which somehow felt appropriate. She'd wanted to be the center of attention, the person everyone had to answer to, the one who controlled everything. Instead, she'd become a cautionary tale, a reminder of how power, even small power like running an HOA, could corrupt if you weren't careful. The young couple who'd asked me about the neighborhood did end up buying the house down the street. They had a toddler son and were expecting another baby. They chose not to join the voluntary HOA, but they participated in neighborhood events and became active members of the community. Their son played hopscotch with the Johnson girl and helped Mr. Chen hang wind chimes in their new backyard. Life went on as it does. The neighborhood continued to evolve, with some old-timers moving away and new families moving in. Each time someone new arrived, they heard the story of the HOA battle, usually told with growing embellishment and drama. I became known as the guy who stood up to the crazy HOA lady, which wasn't quite accurate but also wasn't entirely wrong. Derek and I stayed close friends, and occasionally he'd use my case as an example when teaching younger attorneys about property law and deed restrictions. Always read the original deed, he'd tell them. You never know what's in there. I kept working my contracting business, and ironically, several neighbors hired me to do renovation work on their homes. I took pride in doing good work, just like my grandfather had, building things that would last, creating spaces where people could live comfortably. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I'd sit on my front porch with a beer and watch the neighborhood. Kids riding bikes, people walking dogs, neighbors stopping to chat on the sidewalk. No one measuring grass height or patrolling for violations or threatening fines. Just people living their lives, respecting each other, taking care of their properties because they wanted to, not because they were afraid. That's what a community was supposed to be. That's what my grandfather had understood when he laid out these streets and built these houses. Rules had their place, sure, but so did freedom and trust, and the basic human dignity of being treated like an adult who could make good decisions about their own property. The whole experience taught me something important about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. For years, I'd paid those ridiculous fines and put up with Patricia's harassment because it seemed easier than fighting back. But easy isn't always right. Sometimes you have to take a stand not just for yourself, but for everyone who can't or won't fight for themselves. I thought about all the neighbors who'd been bullied by Patricia, who'd paid unjust fines, who'd been made to feel like they were bad homeowners or bad community members because they forgot to bring in their garbage cans or their grass was half an inch too long. By challenging the HOA's authority, I'd freed not just myself but all of them. That felt good. That felt like something my grandfather would be proud of. Years later, long after the dust had settled and the whole thing had become neighborhood legend, I was showing my nephew around the house. He was in high school, working on a project about family history. We were up in the attic, going through those old boxes again, and he found the original deed. "Uncle Mike, is this the famous deed, the one from the lawsuit?" I nodded. "That's the one." He read through it carefully, his young face serious with concentration. "It's kind of amazing that something written in 1952 could still matter so much." "Good legal documents last," I said. "Your great-great-grandfather knew what he was doing. He wanted to protect what he'd built." "Did you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found this? If you just kept paying the fines?" I'd thought about that a lot, actually. Honestly, I probably would have ended up selling the house. Patricia was making my life miserable, and it would have seemed easier to just leave. But that would have been wrong. This is my home. My grandfather built it. My parents raised me here. Your Aunt Sarah and I were going to grow old here. I couldn't let someone bully me out of it. He nodded, understanding in a way that only family can understand. "I'm glad you fought." "Me too, kid, me too." As I write this now, sitting in the same study where those photos of my grandfather hang on the wall, I can look back on the whole experience with perspective. It was stressful and expensive and sometimes scary. There were moments when I wasn't sure I'd win, moments when I wondered if I was making a huge mistake, but I don't regret any of it. Patricia Whitmore tried to tell the court that she'd built this neighborhood, that her HOA had created value and maintained standards and made Riverside Meadows what it was. But the truth, documented in that 1952 deed and proven through months of legal battle, was simpler and more powerful. My grandfather built this neighborhood. He laid out the streets, constructed the houses, and established the principles that would guide it for generations. All I did was defend that legacy when it came under threat. The neighborhood today is thriving in a way it couldn't have under Patricia's rigid control. Property values are fine, actually better than they were during the strict HOA years, because people take pride in their homes when they're not being constantly harassed and fined. The voluntary HOA organizes great community events and maintains the common areas beautifully. And people have the freedom to live their lives without fear of getting a notice, because their mailbox is the wrong shade of white. That's the real victory, not the legal ruling or the money refunded, or even the satisfaction of proving Patricia wrong. The real victory is preserving the kind of community my grandfather envisioned, where people are trusted to be good neighbors, and where rules serve the community rather than the community serving the rules. Every time I pull into my driveway now, I remember that Saturday morning when Patricia marched over with her clipboard to tell me my grass was 3.2 inches tall. I remember the anger and frustration I felt, but also the decision I made in that moment to stop accepting the unacceptable. That decision changed everything, not just for me, but for dozens of families in this neighborhood. Someone once asked me if I'd do it all again, knowing how difficult it would be. I didn't even have to think about the answer. Yes. Absolutely yes, because some things are worth fighting for. Your home is worth fighting for. Your community is worth fighting for. Your grandfather's legacy is worth fighting for. And the principle that people deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, that's always worth fighting for. Riverside Meadows isn't perfect. No community is. We still have disagreements and occasional conflicts, but we handle them like neighbors, not like rulers and subjects. We talk to each other, compromise, find solutions that work for everyone. It's messy sometimes, but it's also real and human and fundamentally decent. That's what my grandfather built 70 years ago when he purchased that land and started developing houses. Not just a neighborhood, but a community based on mutual respect and trust. Patricia tried to replace that with fear and control. She failed because you can't build something lasting on fear. You can only build it on trust. So here I am, still in the house my grandfather built, still living in the neighborhood he developed, still grateful every day that I found that deed in a dusty box in my attic. It wasn't just a legal document. It was a reminder of who we are and what we stand for. It was the proof I needed to show the court, and the community and myself, that some principles are worth defending no matter the cost. And whenever I see new families moving into Riverside Meadows, young couples with kids and dreams and hopes for the future, I make sure to tell them the story. Not to brag or to relive past glory, but to help them understand what kind of place they're joining. A place with history and values and a hard-won freedom to just be good neighbors to each other. That's my grandfather's legacy. That's what I fought to preserve. And that's what I'll pass on to the next generation, along with that old deed, and those faded photos and the story of how close we came to losing it all to someone with a clipboard and too much time on her hands. The neighborhood my grandfather built is still standing, still thriving, still home. And that's exactly how it should be.